Welcome to Sleepless Folks, a place where we wander softly into the past so your mind can unwind and drift toward sleep. Here, stories become lanterns in the dark, guiding you gently through centuries and civilizations, until your thoughts grow quiet and peaceful. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and tap the like button, not because of algorithms, but because by the end of this lecture, you'll likely already be fast asleep. Now, let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the day slowly fade behind you. Breathe in, breathe out, and make yourself comfortable. The story is already waiting for you. Close your eyes and let history begin. Who was Nostradamus? The name Nostradamus is woven into the collective memory of humanity. Even those who have never opened his books, never read a single one of his enigmatic quatrains, still know the name as a whisper of prophecy, the symbol of the future revealed in poetic fragments. His reputation has traveled through centuries like a persistent echo, from dusty libraries and medieval manuscripts to modern magazines, television programs, and digital headlines. Whenever the world trembles with anxiety, we hear once again, Nostradamus predicted this. It is no coincidence. His writings surfaced during wars and revolutions, during epidemics and natural disasters, during moments when humanity feels uncertainty tightening around its heart. His quatrains, cryptic, haunting, strangely timeless, seem to stretch across centuries, inviting readers to search for hidden meaning. But behind this legendary aura stands a real human being, a man shaped not by myth, but by the turbulence of 16th century Europe. And if we ask, who was Nostradamus really? The answer becomes far more interesting, far more human, and far more mysterious than the legends suggest. There are two images of Nostradamus. The first is the mythic figure, a mystical seer whose shadow seems to fall across the entire history of the modern world. According to this legend, he foresaw everything: the death of French kings during jousting tournaments, the rise of Napoleon and Hitler, the horrors of two world wars, the fall of the Twin Towers, and even the pandemics of the 21st century. To many, he is the prophetic voice of destiny, whose words crackle with supernatural foresight. The second image is more grounded, more real, and perhaps even more fascinating. This Nostradamus lived in a France tormented by plague, torn apart by religious conflicts, and haunted by the Inquisition. He was not only an astrologer but also a physician who tended to victims of the Black Death. He experienced tragedy, loss, resilience, and reinvention. He wrote in a style filled with metaphors, anagrams, double meanings, and deliberate obscurity, a style that invites interpretation and misinterpretation in equal measure. And it is precisely this fog of ambiguity that allows his verses to fit almost any era, any crisis, any story. His quatrains are mirrors, and every generation sees its own fears and hopes reflected inside them. This is why Nostradamus remains so compelling. His texts are not simply predictions, they are emotional landscapes shaped by a world in turmoil. They resonate because they speak to universal human anxieties: fear of war, fear of disease, fear of change, fear of the unknown. When people feel the world slipping out of control, they return to his writings, searching for patterns, explanations, or perhaps just reassurance that someone long ago saw our struggles coming. In this lecture, we will move gently between these two images, the Nostradamus of legend and the Nostradamus of history. We will try to understand whether he was truly a prophet who glimpsed the future, or a gifted writer and observer who sensed the psychological currents of his age and expressed them in a language so timeless that it continues to breathe today. Our journey is not only about his life, but also about the strange power of prophecy itself. Why do humans long for predictions? Why do we hunger for meaning in chaos? And why, after 500 years, do we still open the quatrains of Nostradamus and hope to find answers to our own uncertainties. By the end, perhaps the mystery will not be fully resolved, but the man behind the legend will feel closer, more vivid, more human. And you may discover that the real magic of Nostradamus is not in the future he supposedly foresaw, but in the way his words continue to echo through the centuries, carrying our questions with them. The world Nostradamus was born into. It to understand Nostradamus, we must step out of our modern world and walk back into 16th century France, a place that, despite its Renaissance glow, felt to its inhabitants far more frightening and stable and unpredictable than we imagine today. Modern textbooks present Renaissance France as a land of rebirth, a time of flourishing art, elegant poetry, scientific curiosity, and the slow awakening of reason. We think of Leonardo's sketches, of new globes charting undiscovered lands, of printing presses that filled Europe with fresh ideas. But for the people who lived then, the world was far less romantic. Beneath the surface of beauty lay deep trembling. Life was short, precarious, often brutal. Fear was a constant companion, and nothing embodied this fear more than the plague. They called it La Peste Noire, the Black Death. It did not simply strike once and disappear. It returned in waves, like a terrible tide that kept reclaiming cities again and again. Imagine a medieval town, narrow stone streets, wooden shutters, market stalls, crowds packed tightly together. Within weeks, whole neighborhoods would fall silent, doors marked with chalk crosses, windows sealed shut, fires burning day and night to purify the air, priests whispering last rites, bells tolling so often that their sound became part of the city's rhythm, a rhythm of loss. The plague spared no one. Nobles died alongside beggars. Merchants, scholars, soldiers, children, all were equal before the invisible terror that crawled through the streets. Medicine was helpless. Doctors carried perfumes and herbs, wearing strange masks shaped like bird beaks, hoping to filter out the poisoned air. People searched for meaning in the disaster. Some believed the plague was divine punishment. Others thought it was the work of sorcery or malicious stars. Many simply fled, abandoning cities that once teemed with life. But the plague was only one wound bleeding across France. The country trembled under the pressure of religious hostility that was rapidly rising toward open conflict. Catholics and Huguenots eyed one another with suspicion that soon spilled into the streets, and the years ahead would bring massacres, rebellions, and the deep divide of a nation at war with itself. The air was thick with fear of neighbors, of uncertainty, of betrayal, of God's wrath. Above all this hovered the oppressive shadow of the Inquisition. To live in this world meant living with the awareness that one wrong belief, one unusual thought, one whispered suspicion could cost not just freedom, but life itself. The flames of the pyres were reminders written in fire. Be careful what you say, what you think, what you question. And as if war, disease, and fear were not enough, the imagination of the era was obsessed with signs. Comets streaking across the sky, blood-red moons, strange halos around the sun. Each celestial event was interpreted as a heavenly warning. End times prophecies circulated widely, filling people with dread that the world was approaching its final judgment. Every flood, every earthquake, every famine was seen not as a natural misfortune but as an omen. This was the world Nostradamus entered, a world where knowledge and superstition lived side by side, where science was just beginning to emerge from the shadows, where astrology, medicine, theology, and fear mixed into a single worldview. It was a world yearning for answers, a world that desperately wanted to believe that somewhere, someone understood what was coming. And into this world, Nostradamus began writing. Childhood and youth of Nostradamus. Michel de Nostradamus, a man the world would later know simply as Nostradamus, who was born in December of 1503 in the quiet provincial town of Saint-Remy, nestled among vineyards, olive groves, and sun-warmed stone houses. Today, that region is associated with beauty and serenity. But in the early 16th century it was a world balanced between Renaissance light and medieval shadows. His family was respected, educated, and somewhat unusual for their time. A few generations earlier, his ancestors were Jewish. They had converted to Christianity not for theological reasons, but out of necessity. In an age of suspicion, forced conversions, and sweeping religious pressures, survival often demanded outward change. Yet even after adopting a new faith, the family preserved something precious, a deep reverence for learning, books, knowledge, and the inner world of ideas. This atmosphere shaped young Michel from his earliest years. His father, Jacques de Nostradamus, worked as a notary, a profession that required clarity of mind, literacy, and the ability to navigate human affairs. Their home was a place where documents rustled, inkpots clinked, and visitors came seeking advice. Michel grew up surrounded by scrolls, manuscripts, maps, and the subtle hum of intellectual life. He learned early that the world is shaped not only by soldiers and kings but also by those who read, write, and interpret. From childhood he showed a remarkable intellect. People often remarked that he had eyes older than his years. He absorbed knowledge with a rare hunger and remembered everything he encountered. Books in Latin and Provençal, fragments of ancient poetry, herbal recipes, mathematical puzzles, astronomical tables, nothing was too obscure or too difficult for him to explore. His curiosities were wide and varied: languages and classical literature, mathematics and geometry, the structure of the human body, and the movement of stars across the night sky. This unusual combination of interests would become one of the defining features of his later work. At 14, Michel was sent to study in Avignon, a city of scholars, clerics, poets, and wandering thinkers. There, the young student encountered new ideas and gained access to books unavailable in his hometown. But even this was not enough for a mind like his. He wanted to understand not just how the world works, but why and what invisible forces might lie beneath everything that exists. And so, in the early 1520s, he traveled to the University of Montpellier, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in Europe. Montpellier was a place where ancient texts from Greece, Rome, and the Arab world mingled with the bold new ideas of the Renaissance. Here, science was born and reborn, and medicine was studied with a passion bordering on mysticism. But in those days, medicine was inseparable from astrology. Nobody yet knew about bacteria or viruses. Instead, the invisible causes of illness were sought in the heavens. To heal a patient, a doctor needed to read the alignment of planets, the phase of the moon, the patient's date of birth, and the celestial influences believed to shape one's temperament. A medical diagnosis involved not just pulse and symptoms, but a detailed astral chart. Thus Michel's training included astronomy, to follow the stars, mathematics, to calculate their movements, herbal medicine and surgery, to treat the sick, philosophy, to understand the hidden order behind life, astrology, to interpret cosmic rhythms. Long nights in Montpellier were spent in libraries, lecture halls, and rooftops under the open sky. Students gathered around astrolabes and manuscripts, debating Aristotle, Hippocrates, and the mysterious influences of Saturn and Mars. It was an age when one could believe, quite sincerely, that the universe breathed through the human body, and that to understand the heavens was to understand disease. It was here, in this world of fragile knowledge and bold speculation, that the young Nostradamus began to form the mixture of science, intuition, symbolism, and observation that would later shape his prophetic voice. He was not yet the author of enigmatic quatrains. He was not yet a symbol of mystery or prophecy. He was simply a gifted young man standing on the threshold of a world filled with plague, war, superstition, and wonder, preparing for a life that would eventually carve his name into the collective imagination of centuries. Nostradamus the physician and the wanderer. After completing his studies, Nostradamus stepped into the world not as a prophet or mystic, but as a young physician carrying a doctor's kit, herbal knowledge, and an unusual determination to confront one of the greatest terrors of his age, the plague. It was the early 16th century, a time when Europe lived under the constant shadow of the Black Death. Epidemics swept across towns and villages like wildfires, leaving silence, smoke, and empty streets behind. Many doctors refused to approach infected areas, fleeing at the first rumor of illness. But Michel de Nostradamus was different. He traveled from province to province, answering every desperate request for help. He walked dusty roads, crossed rivers, slept in crowded inns, visited isolated farmhouses, and entered cities where fear hung in the air like a heavy fog. Everywhere he went, people recognized him not by his name, but by the simple, comforting certainty that he would not abandon them. What made Nostradamus remarkable was not only his courage, but his astonishingly practical approach to medicine. While many of his colleagues relied on prayers, talismans, or strange mixtures of ground gems and dried plants, he encouraged methods that, in hindsight, were centuries ahead of their time. He advised people to keep their homes ventilated, avoid dirty or stagnant water, wash their hands and face frequently, change clothing and bed linens, burn contaminated textiles, maintain basic hygiene and cleanliness. For the 1500s, this sounded almost radical. Germ theory was 3 centuries away. Microscopes had not yet been invented, and the idea of invisible organisms was unthinkable. Yet Nostradamus, through observation alone, understood that fresh air mattered, that filth spread disease, and that some invisible element, what he might have called corrupted air, was responsible for suffering. These insights saved countless lives. During outbreaks, he prepared herbal lozenges made from roses, sawdust, cloves, and cypress, remedies meant to strengthen the body rather than fight an unknown enemy. He comforted the dying, helped grieving families, and insisted on offering dignity even to those who had no one left. Over time, people began to see him not only as a doctor, but as a man of extraordinary bravery. When others fled from infected towns, Nostradamus walked straight toward danger, carrying only his experience and his unwavering resolve. To the frightened citizens, he seemed almost fearless, a figure of hope in a world that often felt cursed. Not all of his treatments worked. He was, after all, a man of his era, limited by the knowledge available at the time. But it was not perfection the people saw in him, it was devotion. It was compassion. It was the willingness to stay beside the sick when even family members had abandoned them. These years of travel shaped him more deeply than any university lecture ever could. He witnessed suffering, resilience, superstition, courage, and the fragile boundary between life and death. And it was, perhaps, through this exposure to human fear and human hope that something in him began to shift, the seed of the later Nostradamus. The writer of enigmatic quatrains, the man who would one day be called a seer. But at this stage of his life, he was simply Michel the physician who walked into plague-stricken towns when others refused, guided by a mixture of knowledge, intuition, and the quiet conviction that even in the darkest times, a single compassionate person could make a difference. The plague and the personal tragedy that changed Nostradamus forever. Tragedy often arrives quietly, like a shadow slipping under the door at hand for Nostradamus. It came at the moment when he believed he was helping others survive it. For years he had traveled from town to town, doing everything in his power to stop the spread of the plague. He treated the sick, comforted families, taught people how to protect themselves. But while he was saving strangers, the disease found its way into the place he cherished most, his own home. While Nostradamus was away on one of his medical journeys, the plague swept through his town with merciless speed. His first wife, whose name remains uncertain in the historical records, and their 2 children fell ill. The disease took them quickly, as it often did, leaving little time for goodbyes or hope. By the time he returned, it was already over. The house that once held laughter, the soft steps of children, and the warmth of a family had become silent, empty. Only the echoes remained, echoes of a life he could no longer reach, for a man who had dedicated himself to healing others. This loss was unbearable. He had saved so many, yet could not save the people who mattered most to him. According to many accounts, he was struck by a grief so profound that it changed the course of his life forever. For many years after this tragedy, Nostradamus wandered, not aimlessly but searching. He traveled through France, Italy, and beyond, meeting scholars, physicians, philosophers, and mystics. The curious young doctor of Montpellier slowly transformed into something deeper and more enigmatic. He began to study ancient manuscripts, works of astrology and star charts, medieval treatises on alchemy, secret commentaries on theology, texts about dreams, visions, and symbolic language. He sought meaning where ordinary explanations failed him. He looked for order in the stars when the earth felt chaotic. He searched for divine logic in symbols when human life seemed fragile. He opened books in hopes of reopening the wounded corners of his own soul. Some historians believe that this period marked by grief, wandering, and introspection was the birthplace of the Nostradamus the world would come to know, the writer of cryptic quatrains, the observer of cycles and patterns, the man who tried to grasp the hidden rhythms of fate. Pain did not make him prophetic, but it deepened him. It shattered his former life, and from the fragments emerged a different Michel, quieter, wiser, and far more aware of the delicate thread connecting all human existence. And it is here, in this dark chapter, that the seeds of his future work were planted, not in triumph, not in glory, but in heartbreak. From the ashes of personal loss grew the strange and haunting voice that, centuries later, the world would still be listening to. The searches and discoveries of Nostradamus. After the loss of his family, Nostradamus entered one of the most mysterious periods of his life, years that historians still struggle to reconstruct. What we do know is that he wandered for a long time, moving from one region to another, never staying too long in any single place. Outwardly, he continued the work he knew best. He practiced medicine, offered help where the plague took hold, and treated those who were willing to trust a traveling doctor with unconventional ideas. But inside, another journey was unfolding, deeper, quieter, and infinitely more transformative. Nostradamus was no longer searching merely for cures. He was searching for meaning. As he traveled, he collected not only herbs and remedies but also ideas. He carried with him a small library of texts, worn manuscripts, copied fragments, notes taken during his years of study. In different towns he met scholars, monks, philosophers, and astrologers who opened new doors of thought. Nights that others spent sleeping, he spent reading by candlelight, turning fragile pages of ancient works. He read the writings of Hippocrates and Galen, trying to understand the hidden logic of the human body. He absorbed medieval commentaries on astrology, which claimed that the heavens were a vast clock measuring the rhythm of fate. He explored Hebrew texts, Christian apocrypha, and mystical interpretations of scripture. He studied the geometry of the planets, the mathematics of cycles, and the ancient belief that history moves in repeating patterns. Slowly, A new idea began to grow in him. If the world operates according to cycles, and if these cycles can be observed, then perhaps the future is not completely ignoble. He became fascinated by signs and symbols, not superstitions, but patterns. What if the same kinds of events return again and again? What if history has a pulse, just like the human body, and that pulse can be measured? During these years, Nostradamus practiced what many Renaissance thinkers aspired to. He stood at the crossroads of medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and mystical insight. For him, these were not separate fields. They were pieces of one grand puzzle. And in the quiet of his solitary travels, a conviction slowly formed. If he could gather enough knowledge, if he could learn the language of the stars, if he could understand the subtle hints hidden in ancient texts, then he might begin to glimpse what lies beyond the present moment. Not with certainty, not with the precision of a prophet, but with the intuition of a man who senses the hidden currents beneath the surface of time. These wanderings, filled with study and contemplation, became the foundation of everything he would later write. They softened his grief, sharpened his mind, and drew him toward the great work that would define his name for centuries, the creation of the cryptic quatrains, those strange, poetic messages that the world would later call prophecies. Salon Province, the quiet haven of Nostradamus, after many years of wandering, years filled with grief, study, and the long search for meaning, Nostradamus finally found a place where his life could settle and breathe again. He chose a small provincial town called Salon Province, a peaceful settlement surrounded by olive groves, warm stone houses, and the gentle hills of southern France. It was here, far from the noise of royal courts and the fear-filled cities struck by plague, that his life slowly rebuilt itself. Nostradamus married for the second time, and a new family circle formed around him. The presence of a home, real, stable, warm, may soften the wounds left by his earlier tragedy. In Salon, he was not only a wanderer or a doctor rushing from one crisis to another. He became a husband, a father, a neighbor, a scholar with a place to write and think. Life in Salon Province moved at a quieter rhythm. He tended to patients, especially during outbreaks of illness. He wrote medical manuals that blended practical knowledge with the insights gained from years on the road. He compiled almanacs filled with weather predictions, seasonal observations, and astrological calculations. These annual almanacs became surprisingly popular. Circulating far beyond Provence, people respected him not as a sorcerer or prophet, but as a learned man who understood medicine, stars, and the rhythm of nature. Salon gave him something he hadn't had in years: stability. And it was precisely in this stillness, at a wooden writing desk in a modest house on a narrow medieval street, that a new creative force began to awaken in him. As nights grew longer and candles burned low, Nostradamus slowly turned toward a different kind of work, the writing of enigmatic verses that would one day make him one of the most discussed figures in history. The quiet town of Salon Province became the cradle of his most mysterious legacy. The birth of the Prophecies. When Nostradamus began writing his quatrains, it was during these quieter years in Salon Province that Nostradamus turned toward the work that would secure his name in history. While he continued to practice medicine and write almanacs, a new creative current began flowing within him, one far deeper than practical advice or seasonal predictions. This current would soon crystallize into his centuries, the legendary collections of four-line prophetic verses known as quatrains. But the roots of this transformation lay much earlier. In the darkest corners of his life, when the plague took his first wife and children, when he, a physician, stood powerless before the disease that consumed the ones he loved as something irrevocable shifted within him. He understood, with painful clarity, that medicine alone could not explain the order of the world, nor could it shield humanity from suffering. He had seen too much, cities emptied overnight, streets filled with the tolling of bells, families erased in a single week, fear spreading faster than the disease itself. These experiences carved deep questions into his mind. Why is the world arranged in such a way that misfortunes come in waves? Why are human lives so fragile, so often shaped by forces they cannot control? Is there a hidden logic behind tragedy? Or is everything chaos? And if there is order, could someone learn to read it? Perhaps even foresee it? For Nostradamus, these were not abstract metaphysical puzzles. They were the urgent inquiries of a man who had watched the line between life and death blur again and again. He began searching for answers in the one discipline that claimed to bridge heaven and earth, astrology. In the 16th century, astrology was not a fringe pursuit. It was taught alongside medicine at major universities. The movements of planets, the conjunctions of stars, the cycles of the moon, all were believed to shape the tides of human affairs. Doctors used birth charts to diagnose illness. Kings consulted astrologers before battles and treaties. For a man who had already mastered the medical sciences, astrology offered something medicine could not: a way to glimpse patterns behind the chaos, to understand the rhythms of fate, to peer, however faintly, into the architecture of the future. Nostradamus studied ancient texts with renewed intensity. He pored over writings by Ptolemy, Albumacer, and medieval astrologers. He compared astronomical charts with historical events, looking for echoes and correspondences. He searched for a language capable of speaking about time itself. Slowly, a new form began to emerge in his notebooks of verses dense with metaphor, layered with symbolism, deliberately ambiguous. They were not meant to be straightforward predictions. They were meant to be puzzles, mirrors, and warnings. And so the first quatrains were born. By the time Nostradamus began arranging them into centuries, he was no longer merely a physician or scholar. He had become something else: a watcher of patterns, a collector of omens, a man attempting to read the pulse of the world. The catastrophe that once broke him had become the very force that pushed him toward the work that would echo across centuries. The astrology of Nostradamus. For a modern listener, astrology may seem like a harmless curiosity, something found in magazines, apps, or light-hearted conversations. But in the 16th century, when Nostradamus lived, astrology was considered a serious intellectual discipline, taught in universities and practiced by physicians, scholars, and even royal advisors. In that era, people believed the universe was a vast, tightly connected system. The stars and planets were not distant, silent bodies. They were active forces that shaped the world below. According to the worldview of the Renaissance, the heavens influenced everything: a person's temperament, susceptibility to disease, the growth of crops, the stability of kingdoms, and even the outcome of wars. Nostradamus grew up entirely within this cosmic vision. For him, studying the sky was not a mystical pursuit but a scientific necessity. Astrology as a scientific tool. After completing his medical education, Nostradamus became both a traveling doctor and an avid skywatcher. Every night, he pored over astrological tables, recalculated planetary positions, and studied the writings of ancient and medieval authorities. He read Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, absorbed the works of Arabic astrologers like Albumacer and Al-Kindi, and followed the latest Latin translations coming to Europe through Spain and Italy. In medical practice, astrology was indispensable. To diagnose an illness, a physician had to know not only symptoms and humors but also the patient's birth chart. To choose the right moment for treatments, bloodletting, herbal preparations, diet changes, the doctor needed to study planetary movements. For Nostradamus, this combination of medicine and astrology formed a unified science, where the body and the stars reflected one another, from healing bodies to predicting nations. But gradually, Nostradamus's interests expanded beyond individual patients. The more he studied patterns in the sky, the more he wondered whether the heavens might reveal not only personal destinies, but also the fates of entire kingdoms. This shift led him to create astrological calendars, annual almanacs filled with predictions about the weather, the harvest, festivals, diseases, and more boldly the possibility of unrest or danger. These calendars became incredibly popular across France. Merchants, farmers, nobles, and scholars eagerly purchased them, and Nostradamus's reputation grew far beyond his home in Provence. Yet with fame came risk, the danger of prophecy in Renaissance France. The Church watched closely over visionaries, mystics, and anyone who claimed to foresee the future. The Inquisition remained powerful, and certain predictions, especially those concerning political upheaval or religious conflict, could easily be interpreted as heresy. Nostradamus knew this well. He had seen others condemned for far less. He understood that a reckless sentence in an almanac could cost him imprisonment or even execution. So he devised a remarkable strategy. A genius hidden in ambiguity. If he wanted to speak of future events, he would do it in a way that protected both him and his words. He would write prophecies that were poetic, obscure, flexible, impossible to interpret with certainty. Thus, he invented the unique style of the quatrains, the four-line prophetic verses that would make him famous. These quatrains were written in a shifting mix of French Latin oxen, the old language of southern France, Italian expressions, and occasionally invented or distorted words. This linguistic mosaic gave the verses an air of ancient mystery and made them resistant to straightforward interpretation. He also used anagrams, rearranging the letters of names, symbolic imagery, where celestial bodies represented rulers or nations, mythological references, masking real individuals behind archetypal figures, deliberate vagueness, ensuring each line could fit many possible events. This method served two purposes at once. First, it shielded him from accusations of sorcery or treason. A censor could not condemn a prophecy that was too cryptic to decode. Second, it gave his work a strange kind of immortality. A prophecy written in 1555 could be reinterpreted in 1650, 1850, or 2020 and appear to fit each new century. Nostradamus understood a profound truth: exact predictions die, ambiguous ones live forever. The birth of the Nostradamian aura. As he continued writing, medicine slowly retreated into the background. Night after night, he worked by candlelight in his home in Salon de Provence, studying planetary alignments and turning his visions into shadowy, prophetic poetry. People began to see him not just as a doctor or astrologer, but as something more, a man who possessed hidden knowledge, a figure touched by insight, a sage whose words carried mysterious weight. Soon, even the nobility took notice, and eventually, one of the most powerful women of the age, Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, sought his counsel. By then, the legend of Nostradamus had already begun to crystallize, and he himself was shaping it carefully, reinforcing the aura of mystery around his name, his deliberate obscurity, his cautious symbolism, and the depth of his astrological knowledge transformed his quatrains into something far greater than simple verses. They became puzzles the world has been trying to solve for nearly 5 centuries. The centuries of Nostradamus. When Nostradamus finally turned to the creation of his life's great work, he was no longer simply a respected physician or a skilled astrologer. He was a man who had already endured tragedy, earned fame, and sensed that his true legacy lay not in remedies, calendars, or horoscopes, but in something far more ambitious. It was then that he began composing the book that would make his name immortal the centuries. The Grand Design, 1,000 Prophecies, a very title was chosen with intention. Centuries comes from the Latin centuria, a group of 100. Nostradamus envisioned 10 volumes, each containing 100 quatrains, producing a monumental cycle of 1,000 prophetic verses. It was an audacious plan, almost architectural in its scope, a prophetic cathedral built out of poetry, mystery, and symbols. Each quatrain would be a small stone in this immense structure, and all of them together would form a mosaic meant for the distant future. Yet the work remained unfinished. Some books contain fewer than 100 quatrains, others appear fragmented or incomplete. This incompleteness only deepened the aura of mystery. Readers began to whisper that certain predictions had been lost, hidden, or deliberately concealed because they were too dangerous for the world. The quatrain, a perfect vessel for prophecy, the structure of a quatrain for brief lines, was not chosen randomly. For lines are concise, easy to memorize, and perfect for encoding layered meanings. A quatrain could carry multiple possible interpretations depending on tone or placement of a comma, strange word, and unexpected metaphor. Each prophecy functioned like a riddle, not merely a poem but a cipher, a puzzle awaiting someone who could discover the thread connecting image to event. Humans are naturally drawn to the hidden. A prophecy that announces itself clearly is soon forgotten. A prophecy that whispers invites centuries of fascination, a language built to conceal and reveal to write the centuries. Nostradamus crafted a language unlike any ordinary speech. He blended Old French in the language of southern France, Latin, Italian, occasionally invented hybrid forms for his contemporaries. This was already difficult. For later centuries, it became almost impenetrable. Words carried multiple possible meanings. A single phrase could refer to a place, a person, a celestial event, or a myth. This linguistic ambiguity became the greatest strength of the centuries. Everyone could find in them what they needed, especially in times of fear or uncertainty. Classical echoes, history as a mirror. Nostradamus was well versed in ancient literature. He loved Greek and Roman history, mythology, and symbolism. So when he described contemporary rulers, battles, or disasters, he frequently wrapped them in classical language. King might appear disguised as Julius Caesar, general as Alexander the Great, a catastrophe as a new Trojan war, a political upheaval as a reenactment of Roman decadency. Placing modern events into the frame of antiquity, he elevated them beyond the present moment. His readers felt that they were witnessing not isolated incidents, but chapters in a long, cosmic story in which the past foreshadowed the future. The shadow of the apocalypse, just as strong in his writing, was the influence of the Bible, especially the book of Revelation. Images of fire, blood, eclipses, collapsing cities, broken thrones, and celestial omens permeate the centuries. For people living in an era of war, plague, and famine, these visions felt painfully familiar. The Renaissance world lived under the constant expectation of the end times. Comets, eclipses, and strange weather were interpreted as divine warnings. So when Nostradamus spoke of a great fire set to strike in a year marked by the number 66, people shivered. And when the Great Fire of London erupted in 1666, readers seized upon his verse as undeniable evidence that he had foreseen it. A mosaic of visions, the centuries are not a continuous narrative. There is no storyline, no strict sequence of events. Instead, they are a collection of individual visions, fragments of a vast and fathomable puzzle. Each quatrain is a window. Taken together, they form a kaleidoscope of possible futures. Readers are invited to search for connections. Does one quatrain describe the rise of a ruler? Does another foretell a war? Could a third reveal the consequences? No single answer is definitive. The book demands interpretation and rewards imagination. Symbols instead of names, hints instead of dates. Nostradamus rarely wrote plainly. There are almost no direct references to specific years-known cities' identifiable leaders. Instead, he used anagrams, rearranged letters, masking real names, planets as metaphors for kings, and animals representing nations, celestial omens signaling war or famine. For example, the sun often symbolizes royalty or absolute power. The moon suggests the people, instability, or change. A comet represents war or catastrophe. Symbols served a dual purpose. They shielded him from the authorities and allowed his words to transcend a single era. A sacred book for a fearful age. Despite official suspicion, the centuries spread widely. They circulated in manuscripts and early printed editions, passed from hand to hand, whispered about in noble salons, debated by scholars, and cherished by ordinary people. Some read them as literature, others as warnings. Others still treated the centuries as a kind of continuation of Scripture, a mystical sequel to the apocalyptic visions of the Bible. Even their structure contributed to the myth. 10 volumes, 1,000 prophecies, complete revelation, as if meant for the entire human race. A hybrid of poetry, science, mystery, and fear. The centuries cannot be classified simply. They are not pure prophecy, nor purely poetry. They are a tapestry of historical memory, astrological calculation, classical symbolism, biblical echoes, personal grief, political caution, and collective faith. This is why their influence endures. Nostradamus spoke in the language of his era, yet in a form that allowed every generation to reinterpret his words anew. His verses act like mirrors. Each reader sees not only the prophecy, but also their own anxieties reflected back. And that is the true power of the centuries, not that they predict the future, but that they illuminate the deepest fears, hopes, and shadows of every age that reads them. Prophecies of Nostradamus about France. Among all the quatrains written by Nostradamus, none were read with greater trembling, fear, and fascination than those that seemed to speak directly about France. And he was French. He lived through the sorrows, wars, epidemics, and anxieties of his homeland. And it was the fate of France, not distant kingdoms or exotic empires, that most painfully occupied his thoughts. A country on the edge of ruin, France of the 16th century was not the elegant, blossoming France we imagine today when thinking of Renaissance art and poetry. It was a land fractured by political instability, shaken by religious hostility, exhausted by repeated wars, haunted by the dread of plagues, famine, and divine punishment. This was the era of the Valois dynasty, a royal line trying to rule a kingdom that constantly slipped through its fingers. The people lived in near-permanent anxiety. They looked for signs, omens, warnings. Every comet, every eclipse, every strange dream seemed to whisper, a catastrophe is coming. Into this fertile soil Nostradamus' predictions fell like seeds into plowed earth, ready to sprout into legends. Even during his lifetime, whispers circulated that he had foreseen the fall of kings, the death of Henry II, of the prophecy that made him immortal. The most famous of these French prophecies concerns the tragic fate of King Henry II, a moment that engraved Nostradamus' name onto the map of European history. Henry II was passionate, energetic, and intensely proud of his physical strength. He adored tournaments, those glittering spectacles of courage and chivalric glory. For a king, appearing in armor before the people was not merely entertainment, it was a statement, a living proof that the monarch was still strong, still bold, still favored by destiny. In June 1559, Paris celebrated two joyful events: the wedding of Henry's daughter Elizabeth of Valois to the future Spanish King Philip II, and the signing of a peace treaty between France and Spain. The atmosphere was bright, triumphant, full of hope. A grand tournament was organized. Henry II, despite his age, insisted on participating. His opponent was Gabriel de Lorges, Count of Montgomery, captain of the king's own guard, a man of great skill and respected strength. The first joust ended without harm, but Henry, eager to prove himself once more, demanded a second round. This was his fatal decision. During the charge, Montgomery's lance shattered against Henry's helmet. A wooden splinter pierced the visor and drove deep into the king's eye and skull. For days Henry suffered unspeakable agony. The finest doctors of the age, including those who served his own royal household, were powerless. He died slowly, painfully, as the court plunged into terror. Now let us recall the quatrain that generations connected to this tragedy. The young lion will overcome the old, on the field of battle in a single combat. He will pierce his eye through a golden cage if two wounds made one, and he will die a cruel death. To the people of 16th century France, the accuracy seemed uncanny. Henry was older than Montgomery, the old lion defeated by the young. Their joust was, indeed, a single combat. The king's helmet was gilded, the golden cage. The fatal wound pierced the eye and consisted of both the initial impact and the fragments driven deeper. It was enough to shake even skeptics. For many, this quatrain alone proved that Nostradamus was not merely a poet but a true prophet. The queen's fear had Nostradamus at court. Henry II's widow, Catherine de' Medici, one of the most influential women in Europe, was deeply moved by the apparent accuracy of the prophecy. She invited Nostradamus to court, sought his counsel, and surrounded him with respect, fascination, and perhaps fear. From that moment forward, Nostradamus' fame spread across the continent. His name became a symbol of prophecy, a whisper before every war, every strange sign in the sky, every political upheaval. France descends into darkness, and the prophecies return, but Henry's death was only the beginning of France's torment. Soon after, the country fell into the abyss of the wars of religion, a series of brutal conflicts between Catholics and Huguenots. Cities burned, villages were destroyed, families were torn apart. It seemed as if the entire kingdom was dissolving into blood and fire. And once again people turned to Nostradamus' verses. In them they found images of burning cities, rivers of blood, battles in the heart of great towns, the fall of thrones, divine signs in the sky, and visions of a nation being torn apart from within. These were not abstract metaphors anymore. They were happening outside their windows. Saint Bartholomew's Night, a nation in horror. In August 1572, France witnessed one of the most chilling events in its history, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Thousands of Huguenots were murdered in Paris and across the kingdom. Blood literally ran through the streets. Fires burned. Screams filled the night. And so, once again, people opened the centuries, searching for lines that mirrored the horror. They found them, even if the images were vague, symbolic, or open to interpretation. They felt personal, immediate, prophetic. Nostradamus, for them, had seen everything, from physician to national prophet. Thus, the quatrains about France became the earliest and most powerful proof to contemporaries that Nostradamus possessed a supernatural gift. Two things fed his reputation: precise match as in the death of Henry, and a flexible poetic style which allowed the imagery to fit any catastrophe that followed. This combination made Nostradamus seem terrifyingly accurate. To the people of his time, he became something more than a writer or astrologer. He became a prophet, or perhaps even a biblical one, whose words held warnings for kings and people alike. The prophecies of conquerors, a legacy that outlived France. But Nostradamus' reputation did not end with France. Later generations searched his verses for signs of Napoleon, Hitler, or Warrior, and found them, or believed they did. Yet it all began here, in his homeland, with the fall of a king, the blood of civil war, and a nation struggling under the weight of its own destiny. France was the cradle of Nostradamus' visions, and the first to believe in them. The quatrains about Napoleon, One of the most famous attempts to link Nostradamus' prophecies with later history concerns a mysterious figure who seems to resemble Napoleon Bonaparte. For centuries, readers have searched the centuries for hints about great conquerors. And Napoleon, the man who reshaped Europe at the beginning of the 19th century, naturally became one of the main candidates. In one quatrain, interpreters found a strange pair of words, pow, nay, Loron, or in some variants, what you quoted as Pogni Lorraine. For a reader in the 16th century, this would have looked like nothing more than a curious cluster of names and places. Indeed, Pau is a real town in the south of France. Ney is also a locality in that region. And Lorraine can be read as a distorted place name or regional reference. At first glance, it all seems quite ordinary, obscure geography, typical for Nostradamus' dense, elusive style. But much later, in the 19th century, after Europe had witnessed the meteoric rise and catastrophic fall of Napoleon, readers came back to this quatrain with different eyes. Commentators notice something intriguing. If you read Pau, nay, Loron as a riddle rather than a list of cities, and shift the letters slightly, you can derive the name Napoleon. To those already convinced of Nostradamus' prophetic powers, that felt like a hidden signature to an encrypted name of the man who would one day plunge Europe into war. The quatrain itself, in one of its common interpretations, speaks of a man of low or modest origin, who will rise thanks to his military power, whose fame will spread across all of Europe. It is hard not to see a resemblance. Napoleon was born far from the political center of France, on the island of Corsica, to a family that was not part of the old French aristocracy. He did not inherit power. He earned it through sheer ambition, military genius, and an almost relentless will. Step by step, he rose from artillery officer to general, then to first consul, and finally crowned himself emperor of the French. His campaigns reached from Spain to Poland, from Italy to Egypt, from the heart of Germany to the gates of Moscow. For a time, it really did seem as if the whole of Europe revolved around his decisions. Kings fell, borders shifted, new laws and institutions were born, all under the shadow of his eagles. In this sense, the image his glory spreads across Europe fits him almost perfectly. Supporters of Nostradamus' prophetic status point to this quatrain and say, look, the name is hidden in the strange words. The social background fits. The military rise fits. The European scale of his fame fits. How much coincidence can there be? But skeptics answer no less confidently. They note that Pau and Ney are real place names in France. Loron or other variants can be read as a distorted toponym or simply an obscure word. There is no solid evidence that Nostradamus intentionally encoded Napoleon, rather than simply listing or twisting known names. They also remind us of something very important about the structure of the centuries. Nostradamus writes in such vague, symbolic, and multilayered imagery that almost any strong, ambitious military leader could be forced into this template. Think about it. A man of low birth who rises thanks to his soldiers and conquers half of Europe. As similar things could be said about some Roman generals, medieval warlords, later dictators and conquerors. If the language is sufficiently broad, it can be stretched to match many biographies. And yet, in the 19th century, during the Napoleonic Wars, when Europe was literally burning, from the Peninsular War in Spain to the frozen retreat from Russia, people opened the centuries in fear, anxiety, and hope, and read them differently. They no longer saw Pau, nay, Loron as random syllables. They saw Napoleon hiding in the letters. They recognized in the description of a low-born man turned conqueror the terrifying reality they were living through. For believers, this was proof that Napoleon's destiny had been written centuries before his birth. His victories and his downfall seemed like the unfolding of a script set in motion long ago. For skeptics, it was a classic example of retroactive interpretation. The quatrain became prophetic only after history had happened, when frightened and fascinated readers began to glue vague lines of poetry onto very concrete events. One thing, however, is undeniable. It was in the 19th century, in the era of cannons, coal, and empire, that this quatrain truly became famous. It entered handbooks, pamphlets, and popular retellings as the prophecy of Napoleon. People copied it, discussed it, embellished it. From that moment onward, Nostradamus was no longer just the prophet of Henry II's death or the chronicler of French religious wars. He became the prophet who allegedly foresaw the greatest French conqueror, of a man who would carry the tricolor flag to the heart of Europe, and then drag a defeated army back across the icy fields of Russia. Whether we see in this quatrain a real prediction or a brilliant example of how the human mind loves to find patterns, one thing remains clear: the Napoleon quatrain shows better than almost any other how deeply people want to believe that history is not random, and that somewhere, in old books and faded lines of poetry, the future has already been written. The quatrains about Hitler. Among all attempts to interpret Nostradamus' writings, perhaps none has stirred more controversy than those connected to the rise of Adolf Hitler. The quatrain most frequently linked to him contains a single, haunting word: Hister. To a modern reader, the similarity to Hitler seems almost uncanny. Just one letter separates the two, and during the brutal years of World War II, that resemblance ignited imaginations around the world. In the quatrain, Nostradamus speaks of a great leader rising from the heart of Europe, whose influence will stretch eastward, and whose presence will bring terror to nations. For people living under the shadow of Nazi aggression, for those who saw entire countries fall, cities burn, and millions perish, these lines felt chillingly direct. It was as if Nostradamus had written not in the 16th century, but as an eyewitness to the darkest chapter of the 20th. As Europe collapsed under tyranny, something remarkable happened. Nostradamus' verses suddenly filled newspapers, radio broadcasts, and wartime pamphlets. Hollywood films quoted him. British and American propaganda actively used his quatrains to reassure frightened populations that Hitler's defeat was foretold long before the first shots of the war were fired. In those years, Hister became a global obsession. People believed Nostradamus had named the dictator outright, that he had foreseen the spread of Nazi power and the unimaginable cruelty to come. His quatrains seemed to echo the fear and chaos of the present moment. But as always with Nostradamus, the story is more complicated. While Hister looks eerily close to Hitler, historians point out that Hister is also an ancient Latin name for the Danube River, and by extension, the region alongside it. Classical geographers used the term centuries before Nostradamus was born. In that reading, the prophecy might not refer to a man at all, but rather to a danger or force emerging from the Danubian lands. Under this interpretation, Nostradamus wasn't naming Hitler. He was invoking a region of Europe long associated with conflict and shifting powers. Only later, when the world learned the name Hitler, did readers look back and discover what they believed to be a prediction. This leads to a crucial question: do we genuinely uncover prophetic insight in Nostradamus' quatrains? Or do we project what we fear or already know onto his words? Skeptics are adamant. If the dictator Adolf Hitler had never existed, no one would have taken Hister to be a name. It would have remained a harmless geographical reference. But after World War II, after the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust and the devastation of Europe, the quatrain seemed too powerful, too timely, too uncanny to ignore. And yet, for many, the correlation appeared too precise to dismiss as mere coincidence. A leader rising from Central Europe, terror spreading east, a name resembling Hitler. It all felt like more than chance. It felt like destiny written centuries earlier, whether these connections are genuine or imagined. This quatrain, like the ones associated with Napoleon, became part of Nostradamus' legend. They are the reason his name still circulates whenever the world faces upheaval. They are the reason his books continue to sell, and why every major crisis, war, or catastrophe sends readers back into his tangled verses, searching for familiar symbols and hidden warnings. The ambiguity of Nostradamus' language is both his greatest mystery and his greatest power. It allows one poem to speak to many eras. It allows a single word to transform into a prophecy when the world is desperate for meaning. And it raises the same question generation after generation. Was Nostradamus truly gifted with the ability to see across the centuries? Or did he simply create a masterpiece of poetic obscurity, a mirror so vague and timeless that every age finds its own reflection within it? There is no definitive answer, and perhaps that is why his works survive, why they remain alive in the cultural imagination. Because every time humanity faces a new threat, every time history trembles under the weight of catastrophe, people once again open the centuries, searching for reassurance, or doom, or at least a sense that someone, long ago, saw all of this coming. The quatrains about the Great Fire of London catastrophes have always occupied a special place in the legacy of Nostradamus. For people of the 16th century, disasters were not distant legends. They were daily companions. A single spark could engulf a city in flames. A single ship could bring a plague strong enough to erase entire generations. The earth shook without warning, rivers turned violent, and the sky itself was read as a tapestry of omens. For such a world, destruction was never just destruction, it was a message. A sign, a warning from above. In this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, it is no surprise that the centuries are filled with dark, vivid images, burning cities, collapsing kingdoms, floods, blood, and ruin. People of the Renaissance lived at the edge of dread, and Nostradamus' verses spoke directly to those fears. Among all the cataclysmic quatrains he wrote, one became especially famous, the one later associated with the Great Fire of London in 1666. At first, this quatrain seemed unclear, almost cryptic. Nostradamus mentioned the city of great fire and a mysterious number 66. For his contemporaries, these words were simply another riddle among hundreds of others, unsettling, dramatic, but impossible to decode. But more than a century later, when London was engulfed in flames, the old words suddenly appeared chillingly precise. On the night of September 2nd to 3rd, 1666, a fire broke out in a modest bakery on Pudding Lane. No one could have imagined what would follow. A dry, scorching summer had turned the wooden houses into tinder, and strong winds carried the flames from street to street with terrifying speed. Within hours, fire devoured entire neighborhoods. Within days, it consumed the very heart of the city. For 3 relentless days, London burned. More than 13,000 homes were reduced to ash. Nearly 90 churches were destroyed, among them the majestic old St. Paul's Cathedral. Shops, warehouses, markets, libraries, schools all vanished in a sea of flame. Tens of thousands of people fled the city, carrying whatever they could in carts, on their backs, or simply in their hands. By the time the fire was finally extinguished, London was a skeleton of blackened stone and smoldering ruins. And then, as survivors stood amidst the devastation, someone reopened the centuries. Someone found the old lines. Someone connected the great city of fire with the number 66. And suddenly, Nostradamus' words were everywhere, whispered in taverns, printed in pamphlets, carried across Europe. For many, it seemed certain Nostradamus had foreseen the Great Fire of London. The date matched, the scale matched, the image of a mighty city swallowed by flames matched perfectly to ignore. But as with all things Nostradamus, not everyone agreed. Skeptics pointed out that fire is one of the most common symbols in his writings. He wrote of burning cities repeatedly, because in his era, cities burned all the time. Medieval and Renaissance Europe was filled with devastating fires, often caused by accidents, war, or simple negligence. As for the number 66, it could be interpreted in many ways, as a symbolic number, as a biblical reference, as part of a cycle, or simply as a vague hint without a clear year attached. Nevertheless, for the public, the coincidence was overwhelming. The sheer drama of the event and the eerie echo of Nostradamus' lines cemented the quatrain in popular imagination. From that moment on, Nostradamus was no longer just an astrologer or a poet. He was a prophet of disasters, a visionary whose words seemed to awaken whenever the world trembled. The Great Fire of London became one of the foundational myths in the legend of Nostradamus, the symbol of his uncanny ability to predict catastrophe. Even today, centuries later, that quatrain is cited in documentaries, books, and articles as one of the most accurate and dramatic prophecies in his entire body of work. Fires, earthquakes, and floods, when the elements become prophecy, among all the images left to us by Nostradamus, some of the most haunting are those that speak of natural disasters: fire, earth, and water. These forces of nature were the greatest fears of the people of the 16th century. When the night sky glowed red with flames, when the ground trembled beneath their feet, when rivers rose and turned into violent torrents. Such events felt like living confirmation of ancient prophecy, and the quatrains of Nostradamus seemed to offer glimpses into the chaos yet to come. In the world of his contemporaries, disasters were not rare anomalies, they were part of everyday life. Wooden cities often burned to the ground from a single spark. Earthquakes reduced entire towns to rubble. Sudden floods washed away villages as if they were fragile castles of sand. It is no wonder that Nostradamus returned again and again to these images. His quatrains are filled with trembling earth, blazing cities, and waters that swallow human lives. These were images deeply familiar to anyone living in his time, recognizable and terrifying. For centuries, interpreters have searched these verses for references to real catastrophes. One of the most dramatic examples emerged after the Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755. A tragedy that struck more than 200 years after Nostradamus' death. Massive tremors destroyed the Portuguese capital. A devastating tsunami followed. Then fires swept through what was left of the city. Lisbon was left in ruins. Tens of thousands died. Europe was shaken to its core. Philosophers, theologians, and scientists all struggled to process the enormity of the disaster. And, as often happened, people turned once again to the centuries. They found verses speaking of a city by the sea destroyed by fire and water. For many, this felt like an unmistakable prediction. And with each new earthquake, whether in Italy, Turkey, Greece, or the Balkans, the same pattern repeated. The imagery of Nostradamus was so broad, so elemental, that his words seemed to fit any catastrophe: earth, fire, water, blood. These symbols could be applied to almost anything. The same was true for floods, when rivers overflowed their banks and swallowed homes, when storms wiped out entire regions, when the sea surged into cities. People opened the book of prophecies once again, and once again, they saw familiar language that seemed to echo the present moment. Nostradamus became, in their minds, a witness to the future, a voice speaking across the centuries. This adaptability is precisely what made his quatrains so enduring. Nostradamus did not write about specific towns or dates, he wrote about fear itself. Fear of nature, fear of the future, fear of sudden loss. And so each new disaster was interpreted as yet another fulfillment of his vision. Quatrain after quatrain, catastrophe after catastrophe, the name of Nostradamus grew heavier with myth. And the more the world suffered destruction, the more his verses echoed like a voice that refuses to fade, carried forward by the wind of every new tragedy. Epidemics and the Black Death, Nostradamus' most personal prophecy. Of all the themes that run through the quatrains of Nostradamus, none is as intimate, as painful, or as deeply rooted in his own life as the subject of epidemics. For Nostradamus, plague was not an abstract fear or a distant catastrophe. It was the shadow that followed him from youth to old age, the force that shaped his destiny, broke his heart, and ultimately defined much of his prophetic imagination. In his early years, he faced the horror of the Black Death directly. He watched entire towns empty out. He listened to the cries of families who had lost everyone. And worst of all, he suffered a personal tragedy that left an irremovable scar, the death of his first wife and two children during a devastating outbreak. He was away traveling, helping plague-stricken communities, yet even all his medical skill, courage, and compassion could not save his own family. This grief stayed with him forever. For decades afterward, Nostradamus treated plague victims across France. He risked his life by entering infected cities that others had long abandoned. He devoted himself to creating treatments, advising people on hygiene, fresh air, clean water, and practices that, though simple, saved many. He earned a reputation not just as a healer but as a man of remarkable bravery. And it was this lifelong confrontation with disease that shaped the recurring, haunting images of illness in his prophecies. So when Nostradamus wrote about new plagues rising from the east, nations dying by the thousands, or a great sickness that would engulf the earth, his words carried a weight no mere poet or astrologer could imitate. These were visions born out of lived suffering, out of memories of smoke-filled streets, sealed houses, and the endless tolling of funeral bells. Because of this, every new epidemic throughout history made his quatrains feel eerily relevant. During the repeated waves of plague in the 16th and 17th centuries, Europeans opened the centuries and found verses that seemed like direct warnings. In the 19th century, when cholera swept across continents, readers turned to Nostradamus again and saw in his writings a mirror of their terror. During the great influenza pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu, people rediscovered his lines about a vast sickness crossing the world and believed the Renaissance prophet had foreseen it. And even in our own time, as the COVID-19 pandemic spread across the globe, Nostradamus returned to headlines. Social media rediscovered quatrains about a new plague from Asia, a great sickness in the year of twin numbers, and other symbolic phrases that felt uncannily familiar to a frightened world. Whether these interpretations were accurate or stretched hardly mattered. In moments of fear, people instinctively seek meaning, and Nostradamus' verses offered images ready to be filled with modern anxieties. These examples reveal the essential truth of his work. His prophecies were never tied to one specific date, place, or event. They were written in a universal language of disaster. For a person of the 16th century, his quatrains evoked the Black Death, endless fires, and famine. For someone of the 19th century, they echoed earthquakes and cholera. For us in the 21st century, they resonate with pandemics, global crises, and a world confronting new and unpredictable dangers. This is the secret behind the timelessness of Nostradamus. His imagery, fire, water, sickness, war, speaks to the deepest and oldest fears of humankind. Fears that have accompanied us since the dawn of history, and fears that will follow us into the future. And because these fears never disappear, neither do the prophecies. Every new crisis brings his words back to life. Every global shock makes people open the centuries again, searching for clues, warnings, or reassurance. And every time, they find something, because Nostradamus wrote about the eternal patterns of human experience, not about isolated events. So whether he foresaw pandemics or simply understood the cycles of history, whether he predicted the future or captured the universal language of human dread, his quatrains continue to breathe, to shift, and to speak to us. And perhaps that is why, even in the modern age, his voice has never fallen silent. Nostradamus and Hitler. When people speak about Nostradamus and the great tragedies of modern history, one event rises above all others: the Second World War. Never before had his prophecies been quoted, discussed, or feared with such intensity as during the years when Europe burned and the world trembled under the shadow of Nazi Germany. It was during this time that readers turned to the centuries and claimed to discover lines that seemed to speak directly about Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Third Reich. They found verses mentioning a great leader rising from the depths of Europe, lines about iron armies marching relentlessly toward the east, and, most famously, a mysterious name that resembled Hister or Chitra, a word that many believed was simply a distorted version of Hitler. To the terrified imagination of the 20th century, the resemblance felt too striking to ignore. Even though historians calmly explained that Hister was actually an ancient Latin name for the Danube River, and that Nostradamus was likely referring to events connected to that region rather than to a future dictator, public opinion followed a different logic. In the minds of millions, the river became a man, and that man became the embodiment of catastrophe. And in a century defined by brutal wars, genocide, air raids, and entire nations engulfed in flames, the symbolic images of the quatrains seemed almost prophetic. As the German army advanced across Europe, taking city after city, country after country, the centuries began circulating in a way they never had before. Newspapers quoted them, magazines reprinted them, radio programs referred to them, and astonishingly, even governments joined in. During the war, British intelligence actively used Nostradamus prophecies for psychological warfare. They printed and spread altered or selectively highlighted quatrains through leaflets dropped over Europe, each suggesting that Hitler's downfall had been foreseen long ago. These pamphlets weren't just propaganda, they were crafted to give hope, to help people believe that tyranny would not last, and that darkness was already destined to end. For millions of soldiers fighting at the front and civilians hiding in bomb shelters, these quatrains became a strange form of comfort. In a world collapsing around them, people desperately searched for meaning, for signs that the nightmare would eventually pass, that history was not spiraling into chaos without purpose. Nostradamus' words, half poetic, half enigmatic, offered exactly this sense of hidden order. They made people feel as if the horrors they were living through were not random but part of a grim, ancient pattern that had been predicted long ago. And if the prophecy had already named the threat, then surely it must also contain the promise of its end. In this way, Nostradamus became more than a writer of the Renaissance, more than an astrologer, more than a physician. He became a symbolic guardian of the idea that even in the darkest moments of history, the future might still be known, that chaos might still hold a structure, and fate, however cruel, might still be marching toward a conclusion already written. For the people of the 20th century, living in fear, torn by war, and longing for certainty, this belief was a powerful source of solace. Nostradamus and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the Second World War finally ended, the world breathed in relief only to exhale in horror. The final act of the conflict introduced something humanity had never seen before: the birth of the atomic age. In August of 1945, Two Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were struck by weapons so powerful that even the imagination of earlier centuries could hardly contain them. Entire districts vanished in flashes of blinding light. Shadows burned into the walls where people once stood. A cloud in the shape of a monstrous mushroom climbed into the sky, marking the moment the world crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. And once again, just as it had happened with Napoleon, with Hitler, and with the great catastrophes of Europe, people turned instinctively to the centuries. Readers combed through Nostradamus quatrains and claimed to find verses that spoke of two cities scorched by a sun fiercer than ordinary fire, a new kind of weapon, a force that would leave behind invisible illnesses, a world trembling at the discovery of destruction beyond imagination. To a devastated public, these lines felt eerily precise. The moment they saw photographs of Hiroshima streets flattened, survivors burned, radiation poisoning spreading like an unseen plague, the prophetic interpretation seemed almost self-evident. Nostradamus speaks, they said, of a weapon that burns with the fire of the sun, that brings illness. No, I can see, that kills slowly even after the flames have died. In those haunting descriptions, many saw unmistakable signs of radiation, that invisible terror which does not wound the skin immediately, but slowly destroys the body from within. To a world grappling with the moral and existential shock of nuclear weapons, the connection felt overwhelming. Skeptics argued, of course, that the quatrains were too general, too metaphorical to serve as true predictions. They noted that Nostradamus often wrote about fire, destruction, plagues, and the fall of cities, and that such imagery could be applied to almost any catastrophe across history. But once the images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki spread across newspapers and television screens, public opinion hardly cared about caution. The emotional impact was too great, the disaster too unprecedented. For millions, the belief solidified. Nostradamus foresaw the dawn of the atomic age. Nostradamus and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. 2 decades later, the world experienced another moment of collective shock. It was November 22, 1963, when the United States, then full of optimism, economic growth, and a sense of youthful energy, lost its charismatic president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in Dallas. The nation watched in disbelief as the news spread, an assassination in broad daylight, in the middle of a festive motorcade, witnessed by crowds on the street, and millions more on television. And just as it had happened so many times before, Americans reopened Nostradamus verses. Interpreters pointed to a quatrain that seemed uncannily accurate. A great ruler struck down, a death delivered suddenly, during a celebration, before the eyes of the people. To many, this was no coincidence. They saw Kennedy, smiling in his motorcade, waving to cheering crowds. And then the crack of a rifle, the world stopping in its tracks, the unthinkable unfolding live. Writers, journalists, and television hosts proclaimed that Nostradamus had foreseen the tragedy. Some even suggested he had described the setting, the festival air, the public place, the suddenness of the attack. Historians and skeptics responded with familiar objections. Assassination is a tragic but common feature of human history, and similar quatrains could be applied to Julius Caesar, to Abraham Lincoln, to Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and countless others. Yet none of this mattered emotionally, for many Americans in the mid-20th century, shaken, grieving, and trying to make sense of a senseless event. The idea that Nostradamus had predicted the death of their young president offered a strange mixture of comfort and fatalism. It made the tragedy feel part of a larger pattern, a story already written, a destiny that had been whispered centuries before. And in moments of national or global trauma, that sense of cosmic order, even a dark one, can be strangely soothing. Nostradamus and the 21st century. The beginning of the 21st century brought with it a tragedy so immense, so sudden, that the world seemed to stop breathing. On September 11, 2001, the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda hijacked passenger planes and directed them into the towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. The images of that morning, the smoke rising against a clear blue sky, the collapsing skyscrapers, the chaos in the streets spread across the globe within minutes, and humanity found itself staring into a new era of fear and uncertainty. And almost immediately, the name Nostradamus resurfaced out within hours. Newspapers, TV hosts, and especially the early internet began circulating a supposed quote attributed to him: "In the 9th month, to steal birds will descend upon the towers, and in the great city fire will rise." It spread at lightning speed. Millions believed they were reading a genuine quatrain from the 16th century. In truth, it was a modern fabrication written after the attacks as a piece of internet fiction. But the speed with which people embraced it told a deeper truth. Nostradamus had become a symbol of catastrophe itself. Even when the line was proven false, interest only intensified. People turned to the centuries, searching for echoes of the disaster. Some readers pointed to quatrains that mentioned a great northern city engulfed in flames, to mighty pillars collapsing in smoke, a sky darkened by fire. These images, though written centuries earlier, felt uncannily aligned with the heartbreak of New York's burning skyline. To many, it seemed impossible that such vivid parallels were mere coincidence. And so, just as earlier generations had connected Nostradamus to Napoleon, to Hitler, to the Great Fire of London, and to Hiroshima, the 21st century found its own reflection in his pages. Every new crisis revived him. After 9/11s, the world turned again to his prophecies during moments of global tension, wars in the Middle East, fears of nuclear conflict, financial collapses, and widespread natural disasters. And then, in 2020, when a new pandemic swept across the planet, Nostradamus was once again invoked. People searched for lines about it. Mysterious illness from the east, a plague that will spread across all lands. Whether these connections were accurate or not seemed almost irrelevant. What mattered was how instinctively people reached for his name. This phenomenon reveals the heart of the mystery. Nostradamus does not speak to a single century. He speaks to the universal anxieties that accompany humanity in every age. For the 16th century, it was plague and religious war. For the 20th century, global conflict and nuclear fire. For the 21st century, terrorism, pandemics, and a world that feels increasingly fragile. His quatrains survive because they are written in the timeless language of fear, fate, and uncertainty. They are mirrors, not predictions, reflecting the worries that each generation carries within itself. And perhaps that is why Nostradamus remains alive in our imagination. Not because he foresaw every event, but because he wrote in symbols that never grow old. Every time the world trembles, people return to his verses, searching for meaning, for patterns, for a sense that history, no matter how painful, follows a path that someone once glimpsed in the shadows of time. Unfulfilled prophecies. When people speak of Nostradamus, they usually mention only the quatrains that seem to have come true. These are the lines that echo through documentaries, newspapers, and late-night conversation, stories of kings who died as he supposedly foretold, wars that fit his imagery, and disasters that appear to match his predictions. But if we look at all of his writings, not just the famous fragments, it becomes clear that the majority of his prophecies never found any real-world confirmation. Many of his quatrains, especially those containing seemingly specific hints about years, rulers, or events, simply did not happen. And this is a crucial point that is often left unsaid. Throughout the centuries, we find lines in which Nostradamus names certain dates or refers to particular time frames. His contemporaries awaited these years with fear and trembling, expecting catastrophe. But one year came and went, then another, and nothing foretold in those quatrains occurred. Very quickly, the pattern began to repeat itself. When a prophecy failed, people said, perhaps the date should be interpreted symbolically. Perhaps the meaning is hidden. Perhaps the year was misread or mistranslated. And thus, the tradition of flexible interpretation was born. The shifting dates of the apocalypse. The clearest example lies in Nostradamus' predictions about the end of the world. He wrote of a great destruction, of a final judgment, of cosmic upheaval. In the 17th century, many were convinced that the end would arrive in 1666, a year combining the millennium with the apocalyptic number 666. When nothing happened, the date was pushed forward. Soon, readers found clues pointing to 17,921,844, 1999, and later even 2012. During the global excitement around the Mayan calendar, each time, people waited. Each time, nothing occurred. And each time, belief in the prophecy did not weaken, it only shifted to a new interpretation. Kings, dynasties, and endlessly reinterpreted fates. The same pattern appears in Nostradamus' quatrains about rulers. Some verses speak of the death of a monarch, others of the fall of a dynasty. Yet most of these lines are too vague to attach to any specific person. In one century, readers claimed a prophecy referred to a French king. In the next, it was applied to an English monarch. A generation later, the same verse was suddenly about an Italian duke. When reality failed to conform to the prediction, the quatrain was simply reassigned to the next ruler. The legend of the three antichrists. One of the most persistent myths was that Nostradamus predicted 3 antichrists. It is true that the word antichrist appears in his quatrains, but nowhere does he clearly state a sequence of 3. Still, interpreters created the idea themselves in the 19th century. They named Napoleon the first. In the 20th century, Hitler was labeled the second, but the third. That turned into an endless guessing game. Some named Stalin, others Mao, still others suggested Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, or various political leaders of modern times. Yet the third Antichrist never manifested in any definitive way. Because the text is so ambiguous, anyone can be placed into the role. Why the legend survives? Human memory is selective. We remember the hits and forget the misses. If a quatrain seems to match the real world, it becomes a sensation. If it fails, people simply stop mentioning it. And from this selective memory emerges the illusion of Nostradamus as a flawless prophet, someone whose predictions always came true. But in reality, many of his lines were so vague that they could fit countless situations. Others were simply wrong, and some remain so open-ended that they will likely continue waiting for fulfillment for centuries to come. This is the paradox at the heart of his legacy. His errors do not destroy the myth, they sustain it. Every unfulfilled prophecy becomes a new mystery, a blank canvas for future generations to reinterpret. Modern forgeries interpreters of Nostradamus have always insisted that the unfulfilled prophecies were not failures but simply predictions whose time had not yet arrived. And so, whenever a new disaster struck, people rushed to the centuries and almost inevitably found a quatrain that seemed to fit. But sometimes it wasn't just interpretation at work. Sometimes people intervened directly. There were moments when a catastrophe was so immense, so emotionally overwhelming, that no existing quatrain felt sufficient. And in those moments, forgers stepped in, those who were willing to expand Nostradamus' legacy themselves. If reality did not fit the text, they simply added a new prophecy. The 9/11's hopes that fooled the world after the attacks of September 11, 2001. The world was stunned. To passenger planes striking the Twin Towers, an unimaginable act of destruction seemed to demand prophetic meaning. Within days, a new quatrain appeared online. In the 9th month of the year, to steel birds shall fall upon the towers. It spread across the globe at lightning speed. Newspapers printed it. TV hosts quoted it. Millions believed it. But the truth was simple. Nostradamus never wrote these words. The quatrain was a modern invention, crafted by an anonymous author, posted anonymously, and carried forward by fear, confusion, and the desperate need to find meaning in tragedy. Yet the world embraced it instantly. It fit the narrative to perfectly. And ironically, these forgeries did not weaken Nostradamus' reputation, they strengthened it. The paradox of the prophecy, false quatrains, rather than exposing him, became part of the myth. They reinforced the belief that Nostradamus had predicted everything past, present, and future. The logic became circular. If a prophecy matched an event perfectly, it proved his foresight. If it did not match, then readers had misinterpreted it. If the prophecy was too vague, it was simply waiting for a future event. And if the event was so shocking that no quatrain fit, someone would write one. This flexibility, this endless space for reinterpretation became the true engine of his immortality. The power of ambiguity. Nostradamus' writings are woven in such a fog of metaphors and shifting symbols that, with enough creativity, they can be connected to almost any event. His ambiguity is not a weakness. Paradoxically, it is his greatest strength. The prophecies survive because they do not define, they suggest. They do not describe, they evoke. And because of this, the world continues to return to him again and again, searching for patterns in chaos, meaning in disaster, and reassurance in uncertainty. Through misreadings, reinterpretations, and even outright forgeries, Nostradamus has become not only a historical figure but a symbol, an enduring myth of a prophet who saw everything coming. Why people believe in Nostradamus. When we reflect on the phenomenon of Nostradamus, we inevitably encounter the same enduring question: why do people so willingly believe in his prophecies, not once, not twice, but for 5 centuries in a row? Because when you read his quatrains carefully, it becomes clear that they are filled with misty symbols, elusive images, hints, and ambiguous phrases. They can be interpreted in dozens of ways, sometimes opposite ones. And yet the name of Nostradamus remains a cultural symbol of prophecy itself. To understand why, we must look not only at history, but at human psychology. 1. People need a sense of predictability. The strongest source of fear is not death, not war, not catastrophe. It is uncertainty. We can endure almost anything if we understand why. But living in a world where disaster can strike suddenly, without warning, that is what feels unbearable. When a person thinks about tomorrow, about their children's health, the fate of their country, or possible disasters, an inner anxiety naturally rises. We do not know what will happen, and prophecy becomes something that eases that anxiety, even when it predicts something terrible. Because a terrifying event that is foreseen feels more tolerable than a terrifying event that comes out of the void. 2. Prophecies create the illusion of order. The quatrain is not factual knowledge. It is structure, a framework of meaning. When Nostradamus writes about wars, fire, or a great ruler who will fall, he gives a person the sense that history is not chaos, but a chain of connected events. The future may be frightening, but it is woven into the fabric of the world. It is anticipated. It has direction. This is a powerful psychological mechanism. People feel they are living not in a random, meaningless universe, but in a story where every event fits into a larger plan. 3. Prophecies comfort us even when speaking of disaster. When a nation experiences suffering, war, epidemic, loss, the idea that it was written gives the suffering meaning. It feels similar to belief in destiny. If a disaster was foretold, Then, it is not random, it is not punishment. It is part of a path that humanity must walk through. This transforms prophecy into not only an explanation, but a form of emotional comfort. 4. The human mind is wired to find meaning even where none exists. There is a psychological term for this, apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections in random data. We see faces in clouds. We read messages in smoke. We assign hidden meaning to coincidences. The same happens with quatrains. A person reads fake poetry and assembles it into a coherent narrative using their own imagination. And when an event finally occurs, the coincidence feels astonishing, though it is simply the result of how human perception works. 5. The vagueness of prophecy makes it eternal. Here lies the paradox of Nostradamus. The less specific his words are, the more accurate they appear. His prophecies speak of fears that never vanish: war, disease, famine, fire, tyrants, the fall of the powerful. Cities destroyed. These fears existed in the 16th century, and they exist in the 20th and 21st. And so every new crisis makes the quatrains come alive again. People read his lines and see in them reflections of their time, their emotions, their anxieties. 6. We remember the hits and forget the misses. Another powerful mechanism is selective memory. If a quatrain seems accurate, it will be quoted for centuries. It becomes proof. It appears in textbooks, newspapers, documentaries. But if a prophecy fails, people simply stop mentioning it. And so the illusion arises that Nostradamus was infallible. Yet out of hundreds of quatrains, only a small number appear accurate, and even those depend on extremely flexible interpretation. 7. Nostradamus became more than a man, he became an archetype over time. Belief in Nostradamus stopped depending on whether his predictions came true. He became a cultural symbol, a figure of the wise seer who can pierce the veil of time. A sign of destiny that resurfaces whenever humanity faces a new upheaval. The historical man dissolved into myth, and the myth became stronger than the reality. This is why people continue to believe in him even today, because ultimately, belief in Nostradamus is not belief in a specific individual. It is belief in the possibility of understanding the world, in the idea that chaos follows hidden laws, that every catastrophe has meaning, that the future can be approached not only with fear but with foresight. And as long as humanity lives with anxiety about tomorrow, the books of Nostradamus will be opened again and again. The Barnum effect in Prophecies. One of the deepest psychological reasons people believe in Nostradamus is tied to a mechanism that modern psychology calls the Barnum effect. It describes the tendency of the human mind to perceive vague, general statements as uniquely accurate and personally meaningful, and this plays a central role in how his quatrains are interpreted. 1. Destiny is a form of psychological relief. When people feel that everything is predetermined, a subtle emotional shift occurs. If events are written ahead of time, then we are not responsible for them. We cannot change them, and therefore we must simply accept them. This idea becomes a kind of inner shield, a way to feel less guilty, less anxious, less helpless in the face of tragedy. And so prophecy becomes not just a prediction, but a form of emotional protection. 2. How the Barnum effect works. Well, the Barnum effect shows that people often recognize themselves in statements that are incredibly broad, even contradictory. If you tell someone, "Sometimes you strive for success, but often doubt yourself," almost anyone will feel that the phrase describes them personally. Nostradamus' quatrains rely on this exact mechanism. His imagery is universal. War, fire, blood, fall of the powerful, ruined cities, disease, and famine. These are not specific events. These are archetypes of human fear, timeless, ever present. That is why his prophecies feel accurate in every era. They speak the language of symbols that never age. 3. The same quatrain fits dozens of events because the quatrains are written without fixed dates, without precise geography, without explicit names. They function like mirrors reflecting whatever the reader expects to find. A single quatrain can be interpreted as the Great Fire of London in 1666, the bombing of Hiroshima, the fires of modern megacities, fall of the Twin Towers in 2001, all from the same few lines. When people read a great city will be wrapped in fire, one person imagines London in the 17th century, another sees Hiroshima in 1945, and someone else sees New York in the 21st century. Nothing in the text dictates which one is correct. That interpretation is supplied by the reader. For three experts, three different interpretations. If you give one quatrain to three researchers, each will extract something different. One might say, this clearly describes France in the 16th century, the wars between Catholics and Huguenots. Another might insist, no, it's obviously about the French Revolution in the 18th century. A third will be confident that the same lines refer to the world wars of the 20th century, and all three will believe their interpretation is the right one. This is the Barnum effect at work, the ability of the human mind to fill in the gaps, to see meaningful patterns where the text is deliberately ambiguous. 5. Why this makes Nostradamus eternal. The genius or accident of Nostradamus is that his prophecies are open systems. They are not locked into one era or one event. They speak in symbols so broad that they remain relevant forever. The vagueness becomes a feature, not a flaw. And because every generation sees its own fears, tragedies, and uncertainties reflected in his verses, his prophecies continue to live, continue to adapt, continue to feel eerily accurate. Not because they predict the future, but because they echo the human psyche. The mirror effect in prophecies. There is another psychological phenomenon that plays a powerful role in the mystique of Nostradamus, something often called the mirror effect. It makes his quatrains behave not like predictions, but like reflections. Quatrains do not show us the future, they show us ourselves. 1. Prophecies as a reflective surface. When people read Nostradamus, they rarely see the text as it is written. Instead, they see their own memories, their own fears, and the events they have already lived through. The prophecy becomes a kind of mirror. If the world is shaken by war, people see war in his verses. If an epidemic spreads across countries, his lines about disease suddenly appear prophetic. If cities fall to fire or explosion, his metaphors of a great burning city feel like a perfect match. This creates the illusion of foresight, but in truth, history bends itself to fit the prophecy, not the other way around. 2. Selective memory. The engine of belief. At the core of this mirror effect lies another human tendency, selective memory. We remember the hits, we forget the misses. If a quatrain seems fulfilled even vaguely, it spreads instantly. It's reprinted in newspapers, quoted on television, shared online, read old from generation to generation. It becomes proof of his prophetic brilliance. But if a prophecy fails, people simply ignore it. It vanishes from discussion, as though it never existed. And in this quiet erasure lies the secret of Nostradamus' longevity. 3. The illusion of infallibility. Because fulfilled prophecies are repeated endlessly, and unfulfilled ones are forgotten, our collective memory builds a distorted picture. A Nostradamus who is always right. A Nostradamus who sees centuries ahead. A Nostradamus whose words echo through every crisis, no matter how much time has passed. In reality, this image is stitched together from a handful of coincidences, layered with centuries of reinterpretations, fueled by our desire to find meaning in uncertainty. 4. Why the mirror effect makes prophecies eternal. The mirror effect ensures that Nostradamus never becomes outdated. As long as humanity experiences fear, war, catastrophe, or upheaval, people will return to his quatrains, searching for reflections of their own time. And because his language is vague, symbolic, and open-ended, they will always find what they are looking for. Not because the future was written in his lines, but because we project the future onto them. The prophecy lives not on the page, but in the mind of the reader. The human attraction to mystery in prophecies. There is yet another element that helps explain the strange, enduring power of Nostradamus. Something deeply rooted in human psychology, our instinctive attraction to mystery. People are drawn to riddles, to symbols, to the feeling that behind the surface of ordinary life lies a hidden layer of meaning. Nostradamus quatrains are built in such a way that they awaken this fascination fully and effortlessly. Human beings love to decipher, to search, to interpret. We are natural seekers of patterns, connections, and coded messages. And Nostradamus, whether intentionally or by intuition, created a body of work that allows every reader to feel like an explorer standing at the edge of a secret. His quatrains are not simply poems. They are puzzles. By using metaphors, anagrams, astrological terms, and elusive imagery, he makes the reader feel as though a deeper truth is always just out of reach, hidden between the lines and waiting to be uncovered. This transforms reading into a game, a quiet, private adventure of interpretation and imagination. And for many people, that feeling is intoxicating. This attraction to hidden knowledge is ancient. It exists in religion, myth, occult writings, alchemical manuscripts, and sacred texts. Humans are drawn to the idea that the world is more than it appears to be, that real wisdom is concealed behind symbols, and that truth reveals itself only to the attentive. Nostradamus' writing perfectly mirrors this instinct. Because his language is deliberately ambiguous, every reader becomes a participant in an unfolding mystery. Each person discovers their own meaning, colored by their fears, beliefs, and memories. A prophecy read during a war will sound like a warning of war. A prophecy read during a pandemic will feel like an omen of disease. The text becomes a mirror, not a map. This makes the experience emotional and personal. When someone searches for meaning within one of his quatrains, they are not just analyzing, they are projecting their hopes, their anxieties, their private visions of the future. The prophecy becomes a reflection of their inner world. It feels intimate, as if written specifically for them or for their era. And that sense of personal relevance is far stronger than any logical argument. Ultimately, the lasting power of Nostradamus does not come from accurate timelines or miraculous predictions. It comes from the way his quatrains speak to the deepest parts of the human mind, our need for meaning, our longing for reassurance, our desire to believe that chaos follows hidden rules, and our love for stories that seem to reveal the invisible structure beneath the world. Nostradamus endures not because he foresaw the future, but because he touches something timeless within us. His quatrains are not blueprints of destiny, they are mirrors of the human imagination. As long as people fear uncertainty, as long as we search for order in the chaos of life, and as long as our hearts crave the thrill of deciphering secrets, the mysterious words of Nostradamus will continue to be opened, read, and reinterpreted century after century. The perfect fit for the human mind, this, ultimately, is why Nostradamus became a symbol of prophecy. His writings did not survive 5 centuries because they accurately foretold the future. They survived because they were crafted in a way that fits the human mind with almost uncanny precision. His quatrains give people exactly what they subconsciously long for: order in the midst of chaos, meaning amid frightening uncertainty, and the seductive feeling of touching a hidden truth. Nostradamus did not need to predict specific dates or names. Instead, he wrote in broad, evocative images of war, fire, tyrants, falling empires, trembling earth, disease spreading like a shadow across nations. These are universal human fears, timeless and endlessly recurring. And because they recur, every generation reads his verses and sees itself reflected in them. This is the psychological genius of his writing. We do not find the future in it, we find ourselves. People instinctively fill in ambiguities with their own experiences and anxieties. A vague description becomes specific only after something happens in the real world. Then, suddenly, a line that once seemed obscure appears to have been written with astonishing precision. It feels like prophecy, but in reality it is our brain completing the pattern, giving shape to meaning where none was intended. And each global crisis renews the illusion. When the world faces a war, readers rediscover his quatrains and find lines about great armies or iron birds. When fires devastate modern cities, they find verses about the great fire that will devour the heart of a city. During pandemics, they uncover references to a plague from the East. It feels personal, almost intimate, as if Nostradamus had foreseen our century, our fears, our tragedies. That is why his name resurfaces again and again. Not because his prophecies are accurate, but because they are constructed from symbols that never expire. They speak to the perpetual anxieties of human existence. His writing does not predict. It resonates. It resonates with our need to understand the world, our desire for the future to contain some structure, even if that structure is frightening. It resonates with the comfort we find in believing there is a plan, even when the world seems senseless. And it resonates with the secret pleasure of deciphering mysteries, of feeling as if we are close to some ancient, forbidden knowledge. Nostradamus became more than a man. He became a psychological archetype, a mirror in which every generation sees its own fears reflected back as destiny. And this is why his quatrains are still open today. Why they feel true today. Why they will feel true tomorrow. Because as long as humanity fears the unknown, the verses of Nostradamus will continue to feel like they were written exactly for our time. And now, as our journey comes to an end, let your mind gently drift away from the fires, the wars, the kings, and the shadows of the centuries. His quatrains, mysterious and elusive, were never a window into the future. They were and remain a window into us. Perhaps this is the real secret of Nostradamus. His prophecies are not predictions etched into the fabric of time, but reflections of the worries we bring with us. When the world trembles, we turn to his verses. When we feel lost, we search for meaning in his metaphors. When we fear what tomorrow may bring, we hope that someone, somewhere, has already seen the path ahead. In this way, Nostradamus continues to speak, not because he revealed destiny, but because every generation writes its own fears into his words. As you drift towards sleep, let this thought stay with you gently. The future is not written in the stars, nor hidden in dusty manuscripts. It is shaped by countless choices, the quiet ones, the small ones, the human ones made every day by people just like you. Nostradamus may have captured the shadows that follow humanity through the centuries, but it is we who walk forward into the dawn. So breathe deeply, let the tension of the stories fade, and allow the calm of the night to settle around you. Thank you for sharing this journey through time, history, and the human heart. Sleep well. The night is peaceful, and tomorrow is still unwritten.